on the evening of that first day of the week, when the doors were locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst. And he said to them, "Peace be with you." And when Jesus had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And when Jesus had said this, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained." Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas said, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into the nail marks, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now a week later, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, although the doors were locked, stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." Then Jesus said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hand, and bring your hand and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believe." Thomas answered and said, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, signs that are not written in this book. But these are written that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through this belief you may have life in his name. Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
That gospel reading from St. John covers an 8-day period of time. The reading begins on the evening of the first day of the week, the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And on that day, the disciples were gathered behind locked doors. They were afraid that maybe they too might be killed. And they were trying to make sense out of all the things that they had experienced the past few days. Jesus appears and says to them, "Peace be with you." Thomas was not with them. The gospel passage ends 8 days later when once again the disciples were gathered together, and this time Thomas was with them. Jesus appears as he had appeared before, and the first thing that Jesus says is, "Peace be with you." The Hebrew word for peace, which is the word that Jesus probably used in speaking to his disciples, the Hebrew word is shalom. And I think it's interesting to note that shalom does not mean peace in the sense of an absence of war or the absence of violence. Peace has a different meaning. Shalom means a restoring of something back to its original condition. Restoring something back to its original condition. So with that definition of peace, of shalom, then I think we could say something like this. When a mechanic repairs a car, you could say that he brings shalom to the car because he restores it to its original working condition. When a piano tuner tunes a piano, he brings shalom to the piano. He has restored it to its original condition. When a sick person regains their health, that sick person has received shalom. They've been restored to their healthy conditions. When an unjust situation is corrected, the injured person receives shalom as the injustice is righted. Shalom means a restoration. So when Jesus says shalom to his disciples, he is expressing his love for them and his desire to be reunited with them. Remember in the gospel, the disciples are gathered together with Jesus, and those disciples who are gathered with Jesus were the men who had abandoned him. They were the ones who had denied him. They were the ones who rejected him. They were the ones who left Jesus alone to die on the cross. And when Jesus comes back to those disciples after his resurrection, the first thought Jesus has is, I want to restore this broken relationship with my disciples. Jesus wants to make things right. And so he says to them, peace be with you. Shalom. And with that example of love and forgiveness, Jesus tells his disciples, now you go and do the same thing. Offer shalom to a broken, hurting world. Over and over again, Jesus makes the point that just as we have been loved, so we must love. And just as we have been forgiven, so we must forgive. Just as Jesus forgave those who crucified him, and just as Jesus forgave his disciples who deserted him, so we are to follow that example and forgive those who have offended us. When we offer forgiveness to those who have hurt us, we are really saying to them, shalom. And we are giving them a glimpse of the risen Lord. The risen Lord who works in us and through us to bring restoration to a broken world.